Thank you for staying with us. The UN Climate Change Conference, commonly known as COP29, is currently underway in Baku, Azerbaijan. The conference is a platform for global emphasis on the urgent need for investment in climate action and specifically aims to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now we are joined via Zoom by Professor Fadel Kaboub, an economist and senior advisor with the environmental organization Power Shift Africa. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us, Professor. Your career has focused on economic sovereignty and sustainable prosperity, particularly for the global South. What are some of the motivating factors for you to focus in this particular area?
Well, from an African perspective, there's been a particular economic role that was imposed on the African continent since colonial times, and unfortunately, those economic structures persist to this day. We've been assigned the role as, number one, the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global north. We still play that role today. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation or job creation. But effectively what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. And we still play that role today. So my interest in the issue of economic sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, has to do essentially with ending or decolonizing these economic structures that still persist and lock us in a very unfavorable economic and geopolitical position.
Mm-hmm. Now, Professor, you are also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, which is a research organization focusing on achieving sustainable and economic and environmental policies. Can you briefly take us through its work in detail and how it aligns with the report or the concept of just a transition in the proposed report that you co-authored?
Well, the Just Transition report, which is available online for your viewers to read both in English and in French, the website is called justtransitionafrica.org, which was published by the independent expert group on just transition and development, which was convened a couple of years ago by Dr. Yuba Sukona of Mali, who at the time was one of the vice chairs of the IPCC. And what we tried to do in that report, and a lot of the work that I do with my colleagues and partners and Global South networks, is really to put forward a coherent, comprehensive, long-term strategy from an African perspective, a Pan-African perspective, that will simultaneously address energy, development, and climate policy issues. These are issues that are typically siloed in separate conversations and separate multilateral processes. And what we're saying is that there's really a need to have a coherent long-term strategy. And if we, as Africans, don't have a coherent long-term strategy for ourselves, then I guarantee you we are already part of somebody else's strategic vision. And every major economic bloc, of course, has every right to have a vision for itself, to use its economic diplomacy and incentives to nudge everybody to where they want to see them. But so do we. As Africans, we have the right to have our own vision and use our economic diplomacy to structurally transform the continent in ways that haven't been done before. And in the process, in the context of COP negotiations and climate negotiations and decarbonization conversations, we basically say in that report that we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Mm-hmm. That is the economic role that was imposed on us, you have to remember, was a colonial economic role. And colonial structures were not designed for justice. They were not designed for democracy. They were not designed for a just transition or for human rights. So why do we expect the same economic structures that were violent, hierarchical, abusive, extractive, why do we expect them to deliver a just transition for us? So we can't have a conversation about decarbonization and just transition without having a serious conversation about transforming the economic structures that have been imposed on us.
Okay, so you will also be addressing your policy discussion tomorrow with Namibia as a case study on whether it can lead a Pan-African just transition. So what makes Namibia to stand out? Why Namibia as a case study in this particular discussion?
Well, Namibia is really one of several examples that we have on the African continent today of countries that are engaged in so-called green industrial policies, green industrialization. And there's nothing wrong with industrialization, and it's even better when it's green, except a lot of what we see in Namibia and other places on the continent is essentially a greenwash, rinse and repeat of the same colonial hierarchies that have been imposed on us. I'll give you an example. The green industrial zone in Namibia or other green industrial zones across the continent, you can think of them in the following way. Yes, we're producing huge amounts of renewable energy. A lot of it is displacing people from their own land. A lot of it is producing negative ecological side effects. I'm talking here about seawater desalination that produces a lot of salt brine that kills the blue economy essentially over time because we're dumping the salt back in the ocean, raising the salinity of the ocean, raising the temperature of the ocean, and as a result, affecting the marine ecosystem. So all of that to produce green hydrogen. And of course, green hydrogen, as you know, is very water intensive, and that's why we're doing seawater desalination in Namibia, in Tunisia, and other places. But the problem is, Namibia, like my own country, Tunisia, is a drought-stricken country. So we're prioritizing all of that investment in infrastructure to produce water, not for people, not for agriculture, not for our national economic priorities, but to produce green hydrogen to be exported for Europe's energy security. That's one challenge. The other challenge about the actual industrial zone, when you look at what is being manufactured in African green industrial zones, what is being planned for Namibia's green industrial zones, it's essentially outsourcing the low-cost, outsourcing obsolete technologies in assembly line manufacturing from European markets to be assembled with low-cost labor in Namibia and low-cost energy, and then be shipped back to the EU market, except this time, these assembled products in Namibia are designated green because they come from a green industrial zone. So when they enter the European market, they don't actually pay the carbon border adjustment mechanism tax. In other words, those products enter the European market tax-free. But their competitors, other manufacturers who don't have green industrial zones like the one in Namibia, they have to pay the tax. So it turns out the green industrial zone in Namibia is actually not industrializing Namibia because Namibia is still locked at the bottom of the global value chain, doing assembly line manufacturing for other economies, but it's actually also serving as an inflation management tool for the European Union, and it's a trade weapon against their competitors who don't have a green industrial zone yet. So yes, green industrialization is a great idea, but it has to be on Namibian terms. It has to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity for Namibia and for the rest of the African continent.
So, Professor, what you are saying is that Namibia does have a chance to play smart or to be an equal player in this green economy or the push for just a transition.
Absolutely, and this is where Pan-Africanism comes in. And I don't use the term Pan-Africanism as a nice term we say to each other in nice African gatherings. I mean it as an economic and geopolitical necessity, especially when it comes to industrial policy. Because no country can industrialize alone. Because for real industrialization to happen, you need what we call economies of scale. In other words, we need to manufacture large volumes of the same unit in order for the cost per unit to decline, in order for the efficiencies and benefits of innovation, research and development to kick in. And that's what real industrialization requires. The good news is that at the regional level and at the Pan-African level, we have an economy that is the size of China, essentially, in terms of population, which means we do have not only the complementarity of resources and capabilities on the continent, we have all the critical minerals that are needed for the high-tech revolution, and we have the youngest labor force population on the planet, and we have the economies of scale collectively. What we lack, though, It's the manufacturing technology to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with renewable energy infrastructure, starting with clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on the continent who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis because of lack of clean cooking technology, and that is mostly women and children, by the way, and manufacturing and deploying clean public transportation infrastructure to connect our economies, to connect our cities, to put forward the building blocks of development and prosperity. So these are the kinds of priorities that Namibia and its neighbors can pool resources together and design joint industrial policies, not to manufacture for other people, but to manufacture the building blocks of development for the African continent.
And now, Professor, you are also an advocate for economic sovereignty through what you have termed modern monetary theory. Now, how can Namibia, realistically speaking, how can Namibia use this modern monetary theory to fund sustainable development and, as you just said, avoid dependency on external loans in this particular green industry that it is pursuing?
Well, this is what I call, the $0 industrial policy, this joint industrial policy that I described earlier, and this is inspired by MMT, modern monetary theory. So when you think of the complementarity of resources and capabilities that we have, every country within the region, within the bloc of partner countries, will pay for its labor in its national currency. So you don't need dollars for that. Will pay for its natural resources in its national currency. So you don't need dollars for that. Where we usually need to borrow dollars is to import the manufacturing technology. But if we use our resources and capabilities and offer a bargain to, say, a country like China that has the entire value chain that we want to replicate, and say, look, we enter into a joint venture partnership. You contribute in kind to replicate the value chain of manufacturing solar panels in this economic bloc. And we contribute with our own resources, with our labor force, to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development. And as you start manufacturing solar panels, wind turbines to produce electricity to replace the importation of fossil fuels for our own economy, then you can think of it in this way. Every green kilowatt hour we produce locally saves us the equivalent in dollars we have to borrow to import fuel and interest we have to pay on that debt for decades sometimes. So this is a process of reclaiming economic and monetary sovereignty. And what modern monetary theory is basically telling us is that monetary sovereignty can be thought of as a spectrum. So some countries have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, and some countries don't. Most of our countries have a very weak or modest level of monetary sovereignty. But monetary sovereignty is not something that you declare by decree. It's something that you acquire through strategic investments to substitute for the need of external borrowing, for the need of importing basic necessities like food and energy, for example.
So what you are saying, Prof, is that climate financing equals development finance, and also that the real reform represents a disruption to the current hierarchy, which is a concern. So in this case, do you think that international funding or financing organizations and trade policies are willing to support the country or developing countries who want to be at the forefront, such as in Namibia, when it comes to this, the concept of just a transition, moving it from just being a concept to reality?
Well, the major agencies that you have in mind, we're talking about the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, all of these are part of the post-colonial global economic architecture, which was not designed by us, was not designed for us. So we can't expect it to deliver a just transition for us. That's point number one, that we as Africans have to co-design, co-create our own transformative economic policies. Number two, when it comes to the strategic investments that we need on the continent, they actually have to do with the root causes of external debt. So external debt has three major sources in Africa. Number one, energy imports. Number two, food imports. In Africa, we import 85% of our food. And number three, manufacturing or value-added deficits. And when I say energy deficits, I also include Nigeria, our biggest oil exporter, or Angola, the second largest, because they're so dependent in terms of their actual energy use on importing refined gasoline and kerosene and petrochemicals, whereas they export crude only. So because they don't have the refining technology. So when it comes to addressing the root causes of external debt, we have to invest in renewable energy sovereignty, which is our biggest potential. We have to invest in food sovereignty and agroecology. And we have to invest in high value added green industrial policies. All of these transformative policies happen to be not only solutions to the external debt problem, but they also happen to be climate adaptation solutions. So it's a win-win. So from our perspective, development finance and climate finance are the same thing.
And with the recently adopted Pact of the Future that also called for, that Namibia co-chaired the Summit of the Future that adopted the Pact of the Future, that called for the reform of these institutions. So for the first time in such a long time, the world speaking with one voice, stating that there is really a need for the concerns of developing countries like Namibia, like Tunisia, the ones you mentioned, Angola, as well as Nigeria, the concerns of these countries to be taken into context and the financing mechanism be redesigned to meet or to speak to the objectives of those of the developing world. So do you see those discussions also featuring at the COP29 where you find yourselves?
Absolutely. I mean, the transformation, I prefer to use the term transforming the global financial architecture, not just reforming. All of those conversations are happening in the climate space and the financing for development space, which is another multilateral negotiation that's happening in Spain at the end of June, July of 2025. All of these conversations are happening, but I think those conversations are still too diplomatic. And in the following sense, because when you think of most of our countries that are in debt traps today, debt traps to the IMF and to the World Bank, these are institutions that have essentially dictated our economic policies for decades, micromanage our economic policy choices for decades. The fact that we follow their economic policy prescription to the T and that we are in a debt trap today has got to mean one of two things. Number one, they're incompetent, and therefore we should reject their economic policy advice, or they're actually engaged in intentional economic entrapment. Either way, we have to reject the economic vision that they imposed on us, and we have to think about strategic transformative policies from African thinkers and economists and policymakers rather than imposed by international financial institutions.